It's what we call a face for radio.
Yes, there we go. That's a trait that goes way back, years and years.
All right, well, then here we are. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the third episode of The River, Living the St. Lawrence, along, of course, with Alex and Josh, and along with Derek. How am I saying your last name? Is that Burgos?
Berghuis.
Berghuis. Derek Berghuis. And you know what, guys? This is the third episode. We're going to be talking a lot about the river and the history behind it. And without further delay, I'm going to pass things on to our friends right here, otherwise known as that's Alex and Josh, listed on our broadcast here, folks. But in addition to that, I'll be monitoring things here with Derek. And guys, I'm going to let you take it away. Do you have any? What would you like to start saying or asking questions to Derek, Josh?
So first of all, Mr. Berghuis, I'm very happy to have you. I've been talking with Derek for, I dare say, 5 years now, back and forth, and hoping to meet him on his island. And you can talk about that if you'd like. But I'm glad we are able to connect, and I appreciate your patience. We want to get a little bit about your storied history, both in the U.S. and the Canadian side. And if you want to talk about a little bit of Brockville, the radio past you've got, the city of Brockville, anything to do with the river, we're open to chase those down. Any rabbit holes you see fit. So we're just going to let you do most of the
time. Sure, Josh. I think the history goes way back. On my mother's side, the family was from a small town called Weston, Massachusetts. It's now a suburb of Boston. And around 1776, most family members were not enamored of the rebellion that you folks were having down there. So they hightailed it north, and they were called UELs, United Empire Loyalists, loyal to King George. And they came north and got land in the St. Lawrence Valley. So we've been up here for more generations than I can count. They actually settled both sides. So during the War of 1812, family members fought each other. But one of the families that came up, ancestors, they were one of the founding families of Brockville. And so it's a lot of history for us here. The property that I'm talking from right now, there I can see it, is land that my great-grandmother purchased in 1899, 122 years ago. And they were from Montreal at that point. And I often would ask in the family, well, they must have been very wealthy. This is about 2,000 or 3,000 feet of frontage. Well, they weren't wealthy. They were upper middle class. But in 1899, this was like in the middle of the North Pole. It was that remote. There was no 401 highway. There were no cars. There was a railroad. So they would come up here, and I think they didn't even have enough money to use the property themselves the first few years. They had to rent it out. But anyway, here we are. I'm fourth generation on the property, and my kids, who are now in their 20s, are the fifth generation here in the Thousand Islands along the Canadian mainland. But I just have, I'll talk later on about sort of all kinds of fond memories, having my American college friends up. We're all duals, at least most of us. My wife is Canadian, my mother's Canadian, about the rest of us are all duals in the family. There are a couple of people who are solely American, but 80% of us are duals, and we've been up here for a long time. My dad's from Minnesota and met my Canadian mother. They were at college in Boston together. That's where they met and eventually ended up in Canada after my dad's tour of duty in the U.S. Army. My brother was born on the Army base in Tokyo. So we've all been here. I'm 60 years old. I've never missed a summer, but you learn something new every day. It's the first time I've ever spent a winter here because of the pandemic. So getting to know the Thousand Islands in all seasons. I've passed through different parts of the year in the past, but I've never lived here through a winter before, as we did this past winter.
Winter on the river. And the first one after all that time. That's pretty crazy.
Derek, if I can just jump in real quick. Good to meet you. Alex, could you just give me, I guess, and possibly Glenn and everyone else who's going to be tuning into this later on, your story? So as far as, where you grew up mostly and what you did for a career for most of your life.
Sure. I was born in Montreal, like many English Canadians, and was part of the exodus. We moved to Toronto in '67 as a family. I was 7 years old. And that was when, it was starting to be very uncomfortable for English-speaking people in the province of Quebec. And then in the next 5 years, a huge portion of the English population moved to Toronto. So I was raised really mostly in Toronto, leaving Montreal at the age of 7, and then went to college in the U.S. We all went to American colleges, and my siblings and I, because of our American father. And the next generation has all gone off to the U.S. for college as well, just because we are dual citizens, and we thought, it was thought that we should experience something beyond Canada. And then I grew up on the water here, and Alex, just so many fun memories from my high school years and college years, bringing my friends here. A lot of it was, juvenile fun on the river that we all had at a young age. But when I go back to my college reunions in the U.S. every 5 years, I can't walk for 20 minutes without having somebody stop me and just say, Derek, what an amazing time we had up there in the Thousand Islands, 40 some odd years ago. I was in the broadcasting business, did that at college, with the college radio station. Didn't study radio. I was majored in economics, but worked at the college station, and then started my radio career with CFJR Radio in Brockville, Ontario. And Glenn will know what AM radio stations were like back then. This is a Class 4, 1,000 watt AM station, Radio 145, serving the Seaway Valley with 1,000 watts that sound like a million. And I did not write that liner. And a lot of people would go through these small radio stations and start their careers. I was there for 2 summers. I was doing some on-air work at night from 6 till midnight, but mostly I was doing sales, radio ad sales. And then I went on after college to work at the Wall Street Journal in New York, helped them launch a radio network, and then on to business school after that. And then I was 8 years at ABC Radio in New York before moving back to Toronto in '95 and helping build Canada's first all-news radio station, 680 News. I was the VP-GM of that station. It was a tiny station when we turned off the music and turned on the all-news. And I was told that all news will never work in Canada. Derek, it's an American format. It's a New York City or Chicago format. It's not going to work here. Well, we would become the #1 station in Canada at about, it took about 10 years to get there. It still is the #1 billing radio station in Canada. I also managed the sports station and eventually sales for the 54 station chain. I was Rogers Broadcasting in Toronto, and I'm happily retired now and able to spend more time on the St. Lawrence. But I do drive by CFJR Radio in Brockville all the time, where I started. And I was talking earlier with Glenn about some of the people who went through that radio station, and I would see them in different places in Toronto and New York, and they would all ask about what's happening on the river, what's happening down in Blockhouse Island. There's a certain restaurant still in Brockville, and one was Peter Jennings, and I knew him a little bit. I was at ABC Radio, and he did some work on the radio for us. He was spending most of his time on World News Tonight, and I would bring our affiliates over to meet him. When we had the affiliated stations from across the country coming into New York, it would be a kind of a highlight for them to go over to the World News Tonight set and meet Peter Jennings. And one of my friends from Brockville he's a retired lawyer now, but he was the overnight guy on CFJR Radio, and he really wanted to meet Peter Jennings. So over we went, and Jennings couldn't have been nicer. And before the broadcast, and every break, he would turn around in his swivel chair and pepper my friend with questions about Brockville and the river. And it was back, I think, 2001. CFJR Radio celebrated its 75th anniversary. And I was in Toronto at 680 News at the time, had a call from the program director down here saying, Derek, do you think we could get Peter Jennings to do a little birthday greeting for us? And I said, well, let me send him a note. And I got a note back instantly from Jennings saying, Derek, you tell me what they want, I'll do anything. And he spent a whole hour on the radio with Brockville, just talking about, the river and his memories of his 2 years in this town when he started his career. So it's just a lot of us started here, but for me, it's not just about a career. It's the land that, we're all born around here and raised on the river, and kind of consider ourselves river rats. And we expanded. I got to know Josh a little bit through our island on the U.S. side. And that was just something that's my generation. And there happened to be an island for sale. And I guess I was in my mid-20s to late 20s. And it's American Island. It's St. Lawrence County, New York. It's about 25 feet into St. Lawrence County. It's about an 8-minute boat ride from our dock on the Canadian side. And that was my siblings and cousins. There were 7 of us, and it was going to be auctioned off. This was owned by a Canadian family, and they were leaving the area. So we put a bidding strategy together, and we thought it was going to go for a lot more than it did. And that's why we had 7 people involved, and we got it for what we thought was a very reasonable price. And put it this way, St. Lawrence County, when the first tax assessment came in, we said it's not worth what you say it is. It's worth 25% of that, and we proved it with the auction documents, and we were quite pleased. So it's a 5.8-acre island. It's unbuilt. It's just got a dock there in the middle of the St. Lawrence, and it's got a beautiful, almost a 360 view of the river. Just before you, at the end of the Brockville Narrows, when the river opens up, and then you go upriver, and the crossover will be about 5 miles up, and Singer Island probably about 7-8 miles up from us. We're in the Brockville Narrows.
Derek, I have a question, and it's funny. I did a project for the village of Cape Vincent about maybe 15, 16 years ago, and we were talking about Kingston. It's a 400-plus-year-old city. It's an incredible place. It's like going to Europe, except you're not crossing the pond. But the one thing that I notice about the amount of people that are in the Thousand Islands area, Kingston, Gananoque, and so forth, would you say that Kingston, Gananoque, for that matter, the Thousand Islands and the river itself, is the Miami to Canada like Miami is to America, because it's the southernmost part?
Yeah, I don't think so, because it's a vacation area that most of my friends in Toronto know very, very little about
Really?
Thousand Islands. They know there are a few exits on the 401 if they drive to Montreal or drive to Ottawa.
Right.
It is the south, but I mean, it's a cottage area. Most Torontonians have their cottages. We use the term cottage. I think Americans use the term camp. We have our cottages mostly in Georgian Bay, Muskoka for Torontonians. People from Ottawa can go in any direction. That's just an hour and 10 minutes from where I am. But so there's some Ottawa people here. A fair number of Montreal people came up here. I say up because it's upriver from Montreal. Very few Toronto people. The Miami, the warmest spot in Toronto, in Canada, is actually Victoria, British Columbia. So quite a few people I know would retire in Victoria, BC, just because of climate out there if they want to stay in Canada. But the other thing, too, I think, when I think of Miami, then I think of South Beach, and I think of a very fast-moving crowd.
Oh, no doubt. There's a dynamic difference, but considering it's beautiful and it's the southernmost part of Canada, and obviously Miami's the most southern part of our country, if you look at Hawaii, of course. I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, because it is a paradise. It's not year-round like Miami is.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that people from the largest city, Toronto, aren't familiar with that. Why is that the case there?
Distance. If there's no traffic to our cottage, it's 3 hours and 15 minutes. And to a lot of cottage areas, Torontonians can get there in sort of 2 to 2.5 hours, not 3.5. It could be, if there's traffic, it could be 4 hours to get down to Brockville from Toronto. So it's really, it's proximity more than anything else. I do think it's starting to change. In the past 3 years, property values have absolutely zoomed here on the Canadian side. And for many years, it was just flat, whereas the property prices north of Toronto skyrocketed with Toronto prices. Just got so expensive, poor old grandmothers were knocked out of their houses because they couldn't pay their property taxes. And we were fortunate, our land values did not go up. But I think it's finally being discovered. There are quite a few Toronto people moving here, retiring in Toronto, and to pay up here, it means nothing to them if they're selling their house in central Toronto for anywhere from $3 to $7 million, which is what houses in central Toronto go for now. And if you bought your house 25 years ago for $700,000 and you're now selling it for $7 million, so you overpay in Brockville or Gananoque, whoop-de-doo. I mean, they don't. So the prices are just soaring on this side of the river right now, and it's because of people from Toronto. But that is a very recent, this last 2-3 years that's been happening, and the pandemic has turbocharged that.
No doubt, guys, we've seen the same thing here. I mean, we were talking about it in the previous show, and that there is, I hate to say this, guys, a silver lining, if you will, because people living in the New York City area, Philadelphia, Rochester for that matter, and they look at quality waterfront property and they realize, I can get that for less than $500,000, unsight unseen, I'll buy it. For better or worse, we have seen, again, the bright spot as far as COVID-19. So we've seen the same thing on this side of the border, of the river as well, Derek.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt, because everybody's working remotely. You know, we're fortunate. We have, my wife and I have two homes here on the river, contiguous. We were able to buy out an American cottage next door. It was owned by an Indianapolis family 10 years ago. It was just succession planning because we have 3 children, and put Wi-Fi in there. So my daughter and her boyfriend were there for much of last summer working remotely. And just had a great time, and we even put Wi-Fi in the boathouse. So lots of different workspaces because it's a different, and people can work remotely. I think now kids are going back. Will be interesting to see what happens sort of 6 months and a year from now, how much remote work there's going to be, because I think companies do want their employees to be in the office, but I think there's going to be sort of more flexibility during the summer, and letting people, do some more remote work, and, remote work 2 or 3 weeks in the summer added on to your vacation. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think it's been amazing for the Thousand Islands when you get people up here year round. We've had a little bit of the locals in Ontario not necessarily wanting the cottagers to come outside of cottage season. I think I read that was happening in some parts of the U.S. during the earlier parts of the pandemic, but that's all settled down. And I think that the cottagers are now, all these homes are year-round residences, year-round in terms of being winterized. They were not winterized 40 years ago, so it certainly adds to the local economy just to have people remote working and even just spending time here. It's Brockville's not the strongest economy. I think it's stronger than the U.S. side because it's on the 401 corridor between Toronto and Montreal. So I think by definition, there's just more industry here. But it's still not exactly, small town Ontario is not exactly, Toronto drives the Ontario economy, not the smaller towns.
No. Great. Is that for me? Okay, just getting a little feedback, Derek. Just want to make sure. Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's good. Guys, if you have any question, I just want to delve into the question about fishing, because obviously we just got a huge announcement from Abu Garcia, Derek. I don't know if you saw that, and other manufacturers of fishing products, rods, reels, so forth. What Abu Garcia declared about 3-4 months ago in March, they said St. Lawrence and Eastern Lake Ontario, the best fishing in the country. And I'm assuming that's probably on your side of the river as well, Derek. Did you hear about that?
I did read that because I like to read the newspapers on the other side of the river just to know what's going on both sides. And believe me, we do know about it because at 6 a.m. on Saturday mornings, we hear I think the boats come out of either Waddington or Messina or Ogdensburg, and they have to get their fishing spots, and they go racing up the Canadian Channel. So we certainly hear the boats racing. And I think they have to fish on the U.S. side, but they move very fast upriver at 6 a.m.
Yeah, and that was one of. Now we have 4 tournaments that are coming to the river, because some time ago, and Derek, you can reflect on this. We had what was called the goby fish. We had other invasive species like the zebra mussels, the cormorants. Again, all these things, and Josh can attest to this. They came over by way of ships from other countries like Russia and China. And 20, 25 years ago, guys, that was a big threat to the fishing industry. So, what's going to happen here? 25 years later, the fish are bigger, the water's cleaner. And it looks like we're going to have more fishing than ever before, guys.
I think that's right. And it's kind of through the cormorants that we met, Josh, on the U.S. side. The Americans were a little concerned with what was happening to our island. And we knew that we had a cormorant problem there, and had a call from New York State Wildlife saying, we could help you with the issue. And went out and met the New York State Wildlife Officer and engaged a fellow from Ogdensburg, New York, to come and help with the problem. And all the licensing was done with New York Wildlife and the U.S., the federal agency in the U.S. And we were able to get a depredation permit. And then, of course, with the shooting on the island, a Canadian cottager called 911 and said they're shooting on American Island, and it's not hunting season, so go check it out. And they said, well, it's the U.S. side. So, of course, the U.S. Border Patrol comes racing out to the island. And our guy from Ogdensburg is a former U.S. Navy guy and ornery river guide. He's a fishing guide. And the Border Patrol, as I understand the story, it comes on the island and says, we have reports of gunfire on the island, sir. And our guy Bob says, well, that's what happens when you have guns. Yes, gunfire goes with guns. Yes. And then he provided the permits. And then the Border Patrol officer said, could we use this island for a little surveillance from time to time? And then we kind of connected with Border Patrol at that time. But the cormorants were kind of an introduction to the New York State Wildlife and then effectively U.S. Border Patrol, just how it worked out. So there's a lot of fishing right around American Island during these tournaments. A lot of the boats are fishing right there.
It is perfectly situated. It's right in the middle of the entire river. Views as far as you can see. And you got lots of beavers that like to make home on there too. So we tried to shoo them off if we could. But, I didn't know the origin of that story. So that's very, very good to know. And I have to get with Daryl and let him know that we talked. Maybe even send him this video, but he'll get a kick out of that.
Daryl was a great character. As a colleague of Josh's, and I remember we had a beaver problem, yes. And I remember Daryl emailed me about it, and then he said, I think I can look after it for you. Then I got a note 2 weeks later, I think I did look after it for you, Daryl told me. I said, Daryl, did you shoot them with your service? Oh, no, that would be a no-no in the Border Patrol. We're not allowed to use our service revolvers without an emergency situation, and the Canadian beaver might not be considered a severe but he had a way with those beavers that he must have spoken to them. And those Canadian beavers, I almost thought it would be a good Wall Street Journal article, Department of Homeland Security versus 5 Canadian beavers, and DHS won.
They're clever. They are clever.
They got to be clever. They're engineers, right? They're nature's engineers. They were making the dams before we built the pyramids, probably. Right. Well, fascinating. Well, Derek, do you miss the broadcasting business? I have to ask you that.
I do. I absolutely do. I love the day-to-day of my years at ABC and building a little all-news station in Toronto that would eventually be the highest cuming station, and I'd get in huge fights, Glenn, with my bosses at times because I would write some of the liners, and one of my favorites was just before the top of the hour, thank you for making 680 News Canada's #1 radio station. 680 News Time, 12 noon. And my boss would come to me, and he's the head of the FMs, and you can't say that. You're not #1. What makes you think you're #1? Our FM is #1 in share, and we had the highest revenue. I said, well, how do you say #1? I mean, isn't #1 money, or is it? So we had a great time. I had great colleagues, and I really enjoyed visiting some of the small towns across Canada as well, because in my role heading up sales, I got to see some parts of the country like, Lethbridge, Alberta, and Grand Prairie, Alberta, Vernon, British Columbia, places I would never, ever get a chance to see. We only had one set of stations to get down to Halifax, so I didn't get east that much other than to Halifax. But I just loved it. And having a station on 24/7, it was live 24 hours a day. The young people would train at night doing the overnight show for us, the kids out of university broadcasting programs, and they get pulled into the bigger day parts as they develop. And so much talent came up through the station. And it just rocked. We did news a different way. It was not like 1010 Wins in New York or WCBS, in that we tried to target much younger, and we got a younger audience, and our audience was consistently 15 years younger than the same format delivers in the States. So that was lots of fun. It was all about content and presentation and sales side of it. It's not as fun for the people still in the business though, because it's challenged, as you know.
Right. Yes, it is.
But it's still what my friends tell me in the business. It still does very, very well for its advertisers, and I mean that's key.
Derek, you were in the golden age, essentially. I mean, I don't want to age you and whatnot. You're still a very young man, but you were at the best part of broadcasting, particularly when you were starting the news station itself. That was a pioneering effort right there.
It was just there was never a day that was dull. I talked with my radio friends literally every day, texting back and forth on stuff, and sometimes we lament sort of where things have gone. But it's still a lot of people listen to radio. It's probably been the strongest of all the traditional media. Newspapers and television are having a very tough time. Magazines, terribly. Local radio, there's nothing like local radio, and especially when something goes wrong. And in Brockville, it was the ice storm back in, I think, about 20 years ago, that you would have had that in upstate New York as well. And I know Bruce Wiley, who still does a local show in Brockville on CFJR, it's now JR 104.9, got the highest award from the Canadian Association of Broadcasters for his coverage of that giant ice storm that hit this part of the world many years ago.
Yeah. We had one in '91 that I'll never forget, and the one in '98 went from Rochester right up to Montreal, and Montreal got hit probably worse than everybody. Derek, I just remember the power lines that went down from all the weight of the ice back in January of that year.
I'll never forget that. I was a year and a half old.
Yeah, yeah. Alex was a year and a half old in 1998. That seems like yesterday.
I remember 2 inches of ice on each of the branches of the trees.
Oh yeah.
Our school was shut down for
at
least 3 weeks.
It's amazing. I'm sure there were more. There was only one death around here, thank God. But he was cutting down branches and he fell off the tree. So it looked a lot worse than it actually was. But millions of dollars, and it's just one of those things. And we had two in a matter of 7 years. We haven't really had one since. So hopefully, Derek, we won't have an knock on wood.
We have generators now. We've got the old Generac.
But still, there's a lot. I mean, you know what? Every time I drive down to Long Island and other cities, and I see all the branches over power lines. I said, don't you realize that at any given time, that's the kiss of death right there. Take care of it now, because once the ice comes, it's way too late. But I don't know if people from Long Island got to listen to me. That's for sure. So you have a question?
Oh no, I'm curious about if we could speak to Canada and how they're moving forward and opening things up. And I'm
good point.
Personally, very interested about the Brockville Rib Fest because I really love that and enjoy that. But if you could speak to the Brockville Narrows, I know it's like semi-dredged, almost a 3-mile long stretch that we would love cruising through with our vessels. And it's just a really nice area. I think you said, is it Needles Head or Needles Point Island? It's right about where you're situated. And all the aids to navigation and the big ships going through there, that congested area is very fascinating. And the city, the city of the Thousand Islands, I can't remember the name. Yeah, the Thousand Islands. So it's got a lot of history. And if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Sure. So we're about 5 kilometers upriver from Brockville, 3 miles upriver, and right in the Brockville Narrows. The narrowest part of the river is right behind me, and it's a little island called the Needles Eye. And the border, in terms of opening up, it's really anybody's guess. They just extended the closure for another month to June 21st. I happen to think that there'll be big pressure on the Trudeau government to open up the border for those who are vaccinated, as Europe is doing right now. It is very hard on families who can't come across easily. My brother is he's solely American. He lives in Baltimore, so it's been very hard for him. He did get a right to visit. I got approval for a compassionate visit because my parents are 88 and 86. They lived on the river just east of Brockville. And he was able to come up in November to see them, but would love to be. He has a home here that he's not been allowed to visit. There are lots of American neighbors that we have, families that I could walk to in 5 minutes from here who've been now blocked, and this could be a second summer. And these are families who've had homes for 100 years, who've never missed a summer, have always been up to their homes on the Canadian side. And if they're solely American, they can't come. My sister can come from New York because she's dual and she can bring her American husband, and her kids are dual, so they're allowed to come. They have to quarantine, but they're allowed to come. So I don't think something like RibFest will happen. The Canadian National Exhibition isn't going to happen in Toronto because we're months behind the U.S. in terms of vaccinating people. We don't have the vaccine. We don't have the vaccine production, so we buy it some coming from the U.S., some from Europe. We're about the same percentage as the U.S. is on first vaccines right now, but we are miles behind on the second vaccines. Only 3.7% of the population has had both vaccines. So 47% have had the first. So that closure is going to last. It was quite interesting on the river last summer because from what we understood is that the Americans were quite permissive of Canadian boaters boating into American water as long as they didn't land. They could be in American water, but the Canadian authorities were not as permissive and would send Americans home. So we saw very few New York boats on our side last year. They just didn't come over, it's such a narrow river. They just stayed on the American side. The other thing last year, the Quebecers didn't come because all the islands were closed. And usually when you get to mid-July, there's nothing but French on all those islands that we call the French Navy. Colloquially, the French Navy arrives, all the Quebecers arrive. They didn't come. So I don't know if they're going to come this year. Mm-hmm. I have a feeling things will start to open up, but things are so closed now, we can't even play tennis on our own tennis court or basketball on our own basketball court. My brother has a tennis court. It's one of the oldest courts in Ontario, an old clay court. It's a 5-minute walk from where I am. And it'd be illegal to be on that court right now. As of Saturday, we can now be on the tennis court, but our gyms have been closed. Our barbershops have been closed for months. I haven't had a haircut in 3 months. I won't get one until maybe August because barbershops are closed. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult over here right now. It's hard for an American. I mean, my wife talks to Americans in her work every day, and they just have no idea how locked down we are in Canada. Because it's kind of lockdown is kind of history for Americans.
Well, obviously, not being a political show, so to speak, it's a shame that we always talk about how we didn't handle this well, but it seems like we are handling it better than our northern neighbors. Derek, would you agree?
It's very ironic, and we are, Glenn, mostly a Republican family. Not on every issue. So there's some very hot discussions in Thousand Islands on Saturday nights when we'll have 14 people around the table. And there have been times when people will leave the table because of the discussion going on. Yeah. Because we have, some people far right, some center right, and occasionally Canada is more liberal. There's no question about it. And sometimes there's a left-wing person. Sometimes it gets very, very heated. But what my brother-in-law's test on people who want to criticize the Trump administration, he'd just like to hear them give Trump credit for a very strong pre-pandemic economy and Operation Warp Speed. I mean, those two things were brilliant. If you don't give him credit for that, then my brother-in-law says that means the person is just so far left that they're not grounded. Right. But we were very good on the easy things, the masking, the social distancing. I think our leaders did a good job on that, but they failed to understand that we should have vaccine production, and we easily could have done that a year ago if they had foreseen that there would be vaccine nationalism. They didn't. So we are way behind. And then we have a conservative premier, very conservative, who does not get along well with our liberal prime minister. And they're always pointing the fingers, and people get very tired with all the finger pointing back and forth going on this side of the border. And some decisions have been made by our conservative premier that have not been science driven, canceling golf and canceling tennis and outdoor basketball when there really was very little evidence of spread on golf courses. And, my friends who are golfers have been forbidden for the past 2 months, to be on the golf course. Now they can finally go out as a Saturday, but that was not grounded in science. It was the premier saying, I see people drinking beer after golf and they're going to give each other COVID. There's no real evidence of that. You want people to be outside, not inside. So it did get, all the discussions are quite political. It does become quite political.
No doubt.
Well, just kind of running off that a little bit, I don't want to go too crazy into this, but both Sergeant First Class Todd and I were activated for this pandemic on the American side for the New York National Guard. And we were doing vaccination sites. I'm still running one up in Potsdam, New York. And the talk is, I watched the entire governor's speech today, and he's talking about, now we've got a lottery for people who get the vaccine. if you go into a airport, you can get the vaccine, but none of those are able to be accomplished at any of the sites that I'm at. So Potsdam, Plattsburgh, you can't get your lottery ticket there. You can't get in. You can't get your vaccination at Plattsburgh Air Base or anything like that. And what I'm concerned about is maybe the reason before that is there isn't a lot of people in northern New York who want the vaccine anymore, and we've already hit like the limit of what we're going to get for people who voluntarily want it. But I know for a fact there's people on Derek's side of the river that would love to come over and get their second dose or their first dose. And it seems like we have it, and we definitely have it in the North Country. And I think a large percentage of what we have for our economy is driven by Canadians. So I'd like to see some type of partnership sooner rather than later, because the vaccine is up here. We can't give it to our own people in the North Country because everybody who already wanted it has it. So how do we open up that border while at the same time taking the parallel path of vaccinating our neighbors to the north?
Sure, and Alex, the irony is that all the Canadian snowbirds who did go south this year, who had houses in Florida, they all came back double vaccinated, but they still had to quarantine when they got back here. And if you fly in, you got to quarantine in a hotel. So they would drive across the border or take a cab. They would fly to Buffalo or Syracuse and get a cab or limo home to bypass the hotel mandate. It's just sort of it's been a mess. But the vaccines are gradually opening up, and I think the U.S., you're right, will be awash in vaccines, because I've seen some of the stats that exactly what you're saying, that there's a lot of vaccine, and heaven forbid that some of it expires. A lot of AstraZeneca vaccine that's not approved in the U.S. It's been very effective in the U.K. I had the AZ vaccine here. Didn't get the blood clots. It was available to me, so I drove to Kingston to get it when they opened it up for a very narrow age group. 60 to 64-year-olds were allowed, and I just got in the car and went and got it right away. But I think in time we're going to see a lot more vaccine coming into Canada. Trudeau did say a week ago he wants us to be at 75% first vaccine before he opens the border. 75% may not happen because we have anti-vaxxers too. I mean, I don't think as many as the U.S., but 75%, we might have a closed border for 2 years. It's just
yeah, no, I did hear recently that he is considering it, so it looks like it's imminent. But if 75%, you're absolutely right, Derek. That would take at least a year or so before they open up the border once again. But one of the aspect of, we talked about real estate, we talked about COVID, and how people are perhaps looking at quality of life issues, getting out of the cities and so forth. But the other thing that we haven't talked about that's is the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the water levels. What are your thoughts about the 2014 amendment, Derek? And where do we go from here? Are they taking too much out up in Waddington at the dam, or where do we go from here? And what does it look like to you up there for the season?
Alex is nearest the dam, so let Alex speak to it.
Yeah,
it sounds like the IJC may have let too much out, but they're in a tough position because they don't know the rainfall or how heavy the snow is going to be in the winter. So I think those guys are in a very tough position.
Are they overestimating things because of what happened in 2017 and 19, Derek? And they're just afraid that's going to happen again, so they let too much water out when they should be actually looking at the forecast to see if any rain and snow has fallen in the last 6 months?
It's such a slow process, Glenn. I think in November or December they were letting more out in anticipation of heavier snow this winter.
Right.
That didn't really materialize. It was a fairly dry, light snow in the Great Lakes Basin. So it is a huge problem now. Now I can still get my Sea-Doos out, but we had one over at the island 3 weeks ago, and it's even Sea-Doos don't draw much water, but the water is so shallow there, yeah. It draws a stick into it, and then we'd get the damn stick out of the intake of the Sea-Doo. It's a real pain.
Dangerous, yeah.
And I haven't put the Boston Whaler is going to go in the next few days. And I've hit shoals before, and I'm always embarrassed because at 60 years of age, I should know every darn shoal in this part of the St. Lawrence River. And I still have hit them in the past few years. And there are more shoals now than there have ever been because, of course, the water is so low. So it's going to be a very tough summer. And I worry that if it gets lower, as it usually does in August, that we'll be high and dry. We won't be able to get boats into our lifts.
Does that affect the channel? Does that affect the seaway as far as the large ships are concerned, the pilots? When it gets low?
It does, in the sense that they have to carry lighter loads if the water gets too low, and they can't just sort of close it up down at Iroquois Locks or where the dam is, because they got to feed enough water into Montreal to keep the Montreal harbor open. So you got all these different interest groups who, the fishermen, the boaters, the tourists, the Port of Montreal, navigation, and it's a real mess. Just like when we had too much water, you would just open the floodgates, let it all out. Well, then that would put Montreal underwater.
Right,
so
exactly.
You're trading off sort of the south side of Lake Ontario and all the people from Rochester up to sort of Watertown on the lake there, trading off their interests versus the Montreal harbor and the people downstream. So it's a very tough task for those scientists to figure out. And I'm no expert. I just sort of read the articles that you probably read as well. Mm-hmm. But it's really sad how low that water is. I think navigation is fine for now, but if it gets much lower, it does become an issue.
It does. It does. You
agree?
We're
in the Lake of the Isles today and around Cleveland. Yeah, it's very low. No shoals. Like you said, several years of driving around that river, it's ever changing. And something will just come up and nip you on the side of your hull. But it's a beautiful but a very dangerous river too, because you could be sunning and fishing in one moment, and then a catastrophe can hit, and those winds and waves pick up. But I find it interesting that we're expecting people to forecast rainfall and snow melt from all the way up in Lake Superior, because that lake affects everything down the line from all the Great Lakes. And like you said, affecting Montreal, and you have the fishermen that depend on that, and the marinas, and then the Seaway Development Corporation. Everyone's got a hand in it, and same the river as well. So they want the wetlands to be protected, and they've jockeyed for that position for years too. So
I just wonder if the right people are making the decisions. I mean, if people are actually letting out too much water in anticipation of a heavy snow load, for instance, in that December, January, February framework, and then they miscalculate, then it's too late. You can't get the water back. So, going forward, I mean, we're talking a lot of great things, people flocking up here because of the post-COVID era, so to speak. We're not there yet. But then all of a sudden, we don't have any water. So we're all dressed up and know where to go, Derek. Hopefully we can take care of this. Go ahead.
So, like, when I read Plan 2014, because I ran for a higher office a year back or so, I wanted to know a little bit more than the average Joe about it.
Right.
All the statistics that they used was from basically when the Seaway was finished in 1958 until about 1996. So Plan 2014 was put into effect essentially, almost 22. Well, no, not 22, but
16 years, 18 years later, yeah.
After the statistics ended. And then in the plan, they specifically say this does not account for any difference in forecasting for the future.
Right.
This is just what's happened in the past.
Right.
So the statistics they're working off, because government on this side of the river, I'm sure it's on that side of the river too, Derek, works so slow.
Yeah.
They started talking about Plan 2014 in 1996 using their statistics, and it wasn't initiated it wasn't done till 14, and then initiated till what? Actually started in what?
But I think it was 2016. If it was 16. Just a couple of years later.
So you got all these different years, and then in the specific, it cracks me up. Right. In the plan, it says this does not account for any future, water levels. Well, we're looking at climate change right now. And there's more water than there's ever been. So, you can't even look at the statistics from the past. You got to look at, project for the future.
Well, my question is, why did they do it to begin with? Why is it that the river is the most regulated body of water on the planet? Derek, do you have any insight into that? Why are we regulating it so much?
I don't know what the real reason is. I think it's just to balance all the interests who are upstream of where they can, upstream and downstream from where they regulate that water. And as I understand, the IJC is made up of appointees by both governments. So I don't know, Alex, whether the 5 people on or 7, but it rotates around. So if Canada has 4, the U.S. has 3 for one term, and then it changes the other. So one country always would have a majority, I guess. I think that's the way it's set up. But the International Joint Commission has to figure that out, and they do have some of the top scientists, I would think.
Right.
But Glenn, I think it's weather is just so incredibly hard to predict. It's kind of like saying to your money manager, after a huge crash in the market, well, why didn't we sell 2 weeks earlier? You just don't know what's coming.
2020 hindsight is always better. You're absolutely right.
You don't know it's coming, and they try to get it right, and it's just a slow process. You can't just open a spigot and let it out like a bathtub. It's a very, very slow process of draining the lakes. It's like is it an inch a week or something like that, or not even. It's very, very
right.
And I'll give it to the IJC. They did some really good, like when we had the big problems in 2019. They had like a group going around to local municipalities giving these explanations, PowerPoints, different things like that. I attended 2 of them. And if you look at, they had, it almost looked like a heart rate meter. If you looked at like the levels of the water before 1958, it was like, I don't know if you can see me or not, Derek, but it was pretty big. It was like a good, like if I'm trying to do a little diagram here, it's about a foot, like of like the highest and the lowest points in the river. And then after 1958, when they put in the dams, they did the seaway and all that stuff, it's the same thing, but it's like you shrunk it down. So you still have those highs and those lows, but it's not as big because we're playing Mother Nature, right? We're doing as much as we can to make it more level. And so I guess I understand that, but I think the crazy thing for us was that it happened in 2017, and it was a 1 in 100 year flood or something like that.
Yeah.
And then it happened 2 years later.
Yeah, and 2 years later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's how the governor explained it when I was in Clayton, and he was giving his speech about the money that he gave us. Thank you, Mr. Governor, for our $11 million that we got.
Yeah.
But that's what he was talking about, was that you see 2 floods that were the first time we said it was a 1 in 100 year. This was a 1 in 1,000 year, and now we both had them almost back to back.
Yeah,
so
right.
Something was wrong.
Yeah, something is very wrong
So
there.
let's fix it.
Yeah, and it's great to you mentioned, of course, the governor. He was so good with COVID. So, I wonder if he's figuring things out as far as the river is concerned with all the other people. So I'm being facetious, of course. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he sells the book. By the way, they sold less than 5,000, whatever it was. He made a $5 million deal of 50,000 copies. That's what you call a bust.
Oh, Glenn,
That's the Ishtar of book sales. That's for sure. That's an old movie right there with Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman. Well, Derek, I tell you, this has been great. Obviously, Derek, with the history of you in your broadcast background and everything you know about the Seaway, and for that matter, all about Canadian history and so forth. What can you share with us as a closing comment about the future of the river? I mean, I know obviously the struggle is to keep the water levels high, but now that the fishing is bigger and better and recognized nationally, or for that matter internationally, more tournaments, and hopefully all these fishermen, all these tournaments can enjoy both sides of the river real soon. But where do we go beyond just the fishing tournaments, and where do we go in as far as hotel hospitality, and what is the future of the river on both sides of the border, in your opinion, Derek?
I have to think it's very. I watched you.
Okay, Derek, give me a second. All of a sudden we just had a weak connection. Is that you getting the same thing over there, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Derek, you still there? Okay. For some reason or other, everything was great up until like 10 seconds ago. So everything is still going along. Let's see if we can.
You can probably just, once this gets back to normal, just set them up for the question.
Yeah, and then we can. Oh, we almost had it because we're at yeah, right. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to end the broadcast.
Is there a way to get back in?
Yeah, and just get it and start another one.
Okay.
All right.